Has your God no conscience? Part 2. Welcome to Axteris Lens. This is more than just a video, it's a perspective. A deeper look into the stories that shape our world, the truths we often overlook, and the questions that demand answers. If this message speaks to you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe, so more voices can be heard and more minds can awaken. This video is proudly produced by Axteris Lens. One lens, countless perspectives. The quiet architecture of extraction, France, and the African economy. By Axteris Lens. There are wounds that scream, and there are wounds that whisper. The loud ones, wars, coups, rebellions, make headlines. The quiet ones, contracts, currencies, cooperation agreements, reshape destinies in silence. This is not a story of simple villains and innocent victims. It is more uncomfortable than that. It is a story of systems, carefully built, legally framed, diplomatically protected, that have, over decades, transferred immense wealth from parts of Africa into the arteries of a European power, while leaving behind the appearance of sovereignty. And so, we ask again, has your God no conscience? Or perhaps the better question is, what kind of order allows such imbalance to endure for so long? 1. The inheritance of control. When formal colonial rule began to fade in the mid-20th century, a new language emerged: independence, partnership, cooperation. But beneath that language, structures remained. France, more than most former colonial powers, did not simply withdraw, it reconfigured its influence. What emerged has often been described as France-Afrique, a dense network of political, economic, and military ties linking Paris to its former African territories. These ties were not accidental, they were engineered. Defense agreements ensured continued military presence. Political alliances influenced leadership outcomes. Economic arrangements secured access to critical resources. Independence, in many cases, became administrative rather than structural. The flag changed. The system did not. 1. The CFA Franc, currency without sovereignty. At the heart of this system lies one of the most controversial instruments of modern economic control, the CFA Franc. Used by several West and Central African countries, the CFA is pegged to the euro and historically guaranteed by the French treasury. On paper, it offers stability, low inflation, predictable exchange rates. But stability for whom? Critics argue that the CFA system imposes deep constraints. Monetary policy is not fully sovereign. African nations cannot freely adjust interest rates or devalue their currency to respond to local economic realities. Foreign reserves are partly held in France, limiting domestic liquidity and investment flexibility. Export competitiveness is weakened, as the currency often remains stronger than local productivity justifies. The result? Economies that export raw materials cheaply and import finished goods expensively, a familiar colonial pattern dressed in modern attire. Supporters will argue that the CFA prevents hyperinflation and fiscal chaos, and they are not entirely wrong. But the question remains, at what cost does stability become dependency? 1. Resources, wealth that leaves quietly. Across Francophone, Africa lies some of the world's most valuable natural resources. Uranium in Niger, oil in Gabon and Congo, cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, gold across the Sahel. These resources power industries, fuel cities, and sustain global markets. Yet, in many of these regions, electricity is unreliable, infrastructure is weak, and poverty persists. Take uranium in Niger. For decades, it has been a key supplier for France's nuclear energy, an energy system that powers French homes and industries. Yet large parts of Niger itself struggle with basic electrification. This is not coincidence. It is structure. Contracts, often negotiated under asymmetrical conditions, have historically favored foreign operators. Value extraction happens upstream. Value addition happens elsewhere. Africa exports the ore. Others export the wealth. 1. Political engineering and power retention. Economic systems do not sustain themselves without political alignment. Over the decades, France has maintained close relationships with African leaders, some elected, some imposed, some sustained through external backing. There are documented instances where leaders seen as unfavorable to French interests were isolated or removed. Friendly regimes received military or diplomatic support, regardless of governance quality. Elections were influenced subtly, sometimes overtly. Again, this is not unique to France. Great powers, across history, have acted in their interests. But what distinguishes this case is duration and depth, a continuity of influence that has outlived colonialism itself. And so, governance in some regions became less about accountability to citizens, and more about alignment with external interests. 1. The counterpoint: order, stability, and complexity. To tell this story honestly, we must resist simplification. There are those who argue, again, not without reason, that French involvement has also brought infrastructure development, security cooperation against insurgencies, educational and institutional frameworks, relative monetary stability in volatile regions. And there is another truth we cannot ignore. African leadership has not always been innocent. Corruption, mismanagement, elite capture, and internal power struggles have often compounded external pressures. In some cases, local leaders have willingly participated in systems that benefit them personally while weakening their nations. So, this is not a story of pure external exploitation. It is a convergence of interests, foreign and domestic, that has too often sidelined the African citizen. 1. A generation awakens. But something is changing. Across West and Central Africa, a new generation is asking harder questions. Why must our currency be controlled externally? Why do resource-rich nations remain poor? Why do foreign troops remain decades after independence? Protests, political shifts, and rising public consciousness are beginning to challenge long-standing arrangements. Some countries have already taken steps to reassess military agreements, renegotiate resource contracts, move away from traditional monetary systems. Whether these changes lead to genuine transformation or new forms of dependency remains to be seen. History teaches us this: power rarely disappears, it relocates. 1. The moral question. And now we return to the question that frames this series. Has your God no conscience? But perhaps the question is misplaced. Perhaps it is not God who is silent. Perhaps it is systems built by men, justified by interest, sustained by habit, and rarely challenged with moral clarity. The deeper question may be, where was conscience when agreements were signed that limited generations? Where is conscience when wealth leaves lands that remain in need? Where is conscience when stability is preserved at the expense of dignity? And most importantly, where is conscience within us, citizens, leaders, thinkers, when we accept what we know is unbalanced? 1. Beyond blame, toward responsibility. Blame is easy. Responsibility is harder. If Africa is to rewrite this story, it must confront both. External structures of influence, internal failures of governance. True independence is not declared. It is built through institutions, accountability, economic diversification, and strategic negotiation. No nation rises by emotion alone. It rises by clarity, discipline, and courage. Final reflection. The story of French involvement in African economies is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing negotiation between past and future. It is a mirror that reflects not only what was done to Africa, but what Africa must now choose to become. And so the question remains, not as accusation, but as awakening. Has your God no conscience? Or are we at last ready to answer with our own? If this video made you think or see things differently, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to Axteris Lens, where we uncover perspectives. One lens, countless perspectives.